death was less painful. Estio tells it that he will not kill it. The cactus thanks him. After hearing the human speak, it needed a moment to process. Then Estio spoke to the cactus once more. He wouldn't burn it or freeze it, but since it was his first time seeing one, he didn't know what the ideal environment was, and he asked it to let him know directly when it's thirsty. Since it can hear his voice, Estio asks a favor, to let him know if it finds anything uncomfortable. Hearing Estio's kind words, the cactus calls him God, but he corrects it, saying his name is Estio. The cactus says its name was Ahurakakuruhu Hurakaku. Plants usually have names that long. Estio gives it the nickname Ahuru. Neju is impressed that Estio can even talk to plants. He hears Neju's praise and is pleased with her smile. Then he introduces her to Ahuru. Neju says it's cute. Ahuru thanks her for calling it cute and greets her as well. With his hand on Ahuru's head, Estio says it's not as prickly as he expected. It says it's being nice because it's Estio. Normally, it hurts if pricked properly. Estio asks if that's really possible. Ahuru says yes, but it still can't fully move its body. Curious about its words, Estio asks what it means by still. Ahuru says that if plants live long enough or if their will is strong enough, they can move as they wish. It is still young, but its will is strong, so it can control whether its thorns prick or not. While they were talking, someone arrives, asking if he didn't tell him not to return. Estio turns his head to see who it is. The Viscount's other son is staring at him. He approaches Estio, asking if his memory is bad, or if he took his words as a joke. Estio was about to say that the Viscount had called him, but he interrupts, asking if he can also teach animals to speak besides reading hearts, and calls him a monster in front of Neju. Estio doesn't seem to like the way he is speaking to them. Then he continues, saying that besides raising talking beasts, he wonders if Estio is also trying to teach plants to speak. His gaze turns to Neju, analyzing her white body and red eyes, saying that an animal that learned to speak could be very valuable. He asks how much Neju costs. Estio remains silent, not responding. Even without a response, the young man continues his provocation, saying he will buy her from him, thinking that with such a big body, it would be difficult for him to feed her. Hearing what the young man says, Ahuru becomes very upset and asks if he is stupid. Estio says that Neju is not for sale. The young man said the negotiation was over since he could read his mind. Then he hands over the 10 gold coins he had with him. Again, he says that Neju is not for sale, but the young man interrupts, saying it's not good to be too greedy. He asks how much he really wants for her. Expressionless, Estio rejects his offer, saying he won't sell her. This attitude irritates the young man. He shouts, asking how a commoner can refuse a noble's offer, and that he has been holding back from hitting him after ignoring his warning not to return. Neju is uncomfortable with the shouting. Estio says he only came to the mansion at the Viscount's call. The young man retorts, saying he is quick to talk nonsense. Lifting him by the collar, the young man shouts at Estio, asking if he wouldn't have his evil heart. This action irritated Neju so much that she shouted for him not to insult him. Startled by her shouting, the young man releases Estio. He falls to the ground off balance. Neju asks if he is okay. Estio lifts himself, saying he is fine. A small smile appears on the young man's face. He says that for the monkey's loyalty, he will offer 30 gold coins. The young man calls the 3 nearby guards and orders them to take Neju to the breeding field immediately. Estio shouts, saying for the last time that he will not sell Neju. The young man becomes completely furious and shouts, saying he has gone mad for raising his voice in front of a noble. Estio remains silent, because he could only stay silent in this situation. He was surrounded by 4 mansion guards, thinking about what to do now that it had come to this point. One of the guards orders him to hand over Neju, but his arm is injured in an instant. He hardly had time to react as it was so fast he couldn't see. His screams are heard throughout the house. It was Neju who attacked him. Her hand was red, and the carpet was stained. The others were frightened to see this. The young man clenches his hand in anger, saying he had the audacity to hurt a servant in the Fabian house. More guards arrive to try to help. Pointing at Estio, he says that he tried to kill him and to arrest him immediately. Immediately, a trap is activated. A net is thrown over Neju, capturing her. Next, an electric current is activated, paralyzing her. She says that they were the ones who called her a monster before and asks how they can act more like monsters than real monsters. The guards raise their swords to attack her. She roars furiously to intimidate them. The young man is frightened by the roar. Then the Viscount arrives at the scene and asks his son Jeremian what he was doing. Irritated, he looks at his son and says that he caused something that would naturally be under his control if he hadn't interfered. His son tries to explain, but he tells him to shut up. Then he tries to calm himself by taking a deep breath. He orders the knights to capture Estio alive, but says he doesn't care what happens to Neju. The knights position themselves to obey his command. They activate fire magic with their hands. Neju is frightened and warns Estio about the magic. The Viscount and his son look at them expressionlessly. Estio tries to remove the net from Neju. She apologizes to Estio because she just wanted to stay by his side. Then he tells her that she doesn't need to apologize. Neju says that this seems to be her end, and then she lowers her head, accepting her fate. All the guards had finished preparing their attack magic and released it. The fire magic caused a great explosion in the hall. The Viscount and Jeremian shield their eyes from the smoke, and in Jeremian's mind he thinks that nothing would have happened if Estio had accepted the money. Then a shadow appears in the smoke. Estio says that the one who needs to apologize is not Neju, but rather the Viscount and his family. Both are surprised to see him survive the explosive magic. He orders them to get rid of Estio. The guard behind him prepares. He tries to use his magic again. This time his body is strengthened, increasing the size of his muscles. With his power in his body, he attacks Estio from behind. However, our protagonist's eyes shine. He makes eye contact with the attacking guard. An inexplicable source of fear begins to arise in him. He slowly backs away from Estio and points his sword at his own heart. Viscount Lemel asks what his soldier is doing, but is too late, and he goes for the kill. Strawberry juice splashes on Estio's face. He turns to look at the others. The soldiers beside him start to feel fear. This time, he doesn't use his power to attack. The soldiers feel an emptiness inside them and immediately drop their weapons, falling at Estio's feet. Everyone around him fainted on the ground. Estio's face hardens as he looks at the floor. Terrified, Jeremian falls to the ground. He looks at the Viscount and Jeremian. Then Lady Saralyn arrives, descending the stairs and sees the entire scene. Indifferent, Estio stands among the bodies of the soldiers. She raises her hand to cover her face, but the shock was so strong that she faints on the stairs. Lemel immediately runs to save her from the fall. Holding his daughter in his arms, he tries to make Estio feel guilty, asking if he is satisfied. Then he asks if he wants more blood to be shed. Estio wonders why he should hold back, even with the suffering in his childhood, and up to this moment when Neju was mistreated. The reason to hold back never existed. He clenches his hand. Even now, if he wanted to, he could kill them. Then he tells the Viscount that he will stop, saying that it is good that he is a friend who understands, and in return, asks him to pretend that nothing happened here. Frightened, the Viscount looks at him doubtfully. Jeremian calls Estio a murderer and complains that after everything he did, he still wants them to pretend that nothing happened. Turning to look at Jeremian, Estio tells him that he is not asking, but that he is ordering them to forget. With terror in his eyes, Jeremian goes into shock. Then he also faints to the ground. All the members of the Fabian family are unconscious at this moment. Someone calls Estio from behind. It was a black cat named Suki. The cat starts to transform and grows in size as well, becoming a magnificent black tiger. He asks why Estio is standing still since he cannot carry Neju alone. Immediately, Estio removes the net from her and places Neju on Suki's back. He also tells Estio to get on his back, but Estio says that Suki will only get more tired and prefers to walk. Suki says that carrying him along is not a problem, so Estio says he will be in his care. Then they start running out of the mansion, running in the middle of the night out of the Fabian territory. Estio catches Suki's attention along the way. He responds by asking what it is. With this sad look, he says that it seems he really is a monster. Besides reading people's hearts, he can also control them and even make people die. But despite this, he didn't feel any remorse in his heart. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he didn't feel fear or sadness. Suki asks, so what if he didn't feel anything? And says that if it were him, he would have killed them all. He says there is no reason to feel fear or sadness for those who hurt someone important to him and even calls him soft. Estio says that in the end, the one who was hurting others was him. Suki says he might have felt a little sad because he didn't want to hurt anyone. Haru asks to say something too, saying that there is no way someone can be a monster if he cares so much about being a normal person or not, and even if he's not, so what? There is nothing wrong with being a monster if he likes a talking monkey and a cat that transforms into a tiger. Then Haru realizes he said more than one thing and apologizes for talking too much. At the Agnes Guild, the manager is shouting. A person with bird wings apologizes, saying that it was an order from the superiors, and he curses the messenger, calling him a pigeon. The messenger corrects him, saying he is an avian and not a pigeon, as an avian is a birdman species. The secretary arrives to calm the manager down. Then she takes a look at the letter he received. It's a summons order from the guild requesting Estio's presence. She wonders if the royal family pressured them or if someone from HQ thinks Estio is a dangerous ability user. But he had been missing for almost 10 days and there were still rumors about Viscount Fabien. The manager says that Estio is not someone who would hurt another person. The secretary speaks to the manager and he calms down to listen to her. She says that Estio had returned. He apologizes for taking so long to come back. His clothes were dirty and wrinkled. The manager tries to gather words to say something, but looking at Estio's face, he realizes something may have happened. Then he raises his arm towards him and puts his hand on his shoulder, saying he did a good job. Estio asks if he won't question him about the details of what he did. Obviously, the manager says that he will have to submit a mission report. He has no idea how worried they were when they couldn't contact him anymore. The messenger clears his throat with a cough. Then the manager says it is a relief he returned since this job was a bit complicated, and they have had many cases where they lost valuable people in vain. Curious, the manager asks where Estio's partner had gone. He asks which partner he is referring to, and the manager says Neju. Estio says she got a bit hurt, so she is resting. She is almost fully healed, but they are taking it slow. Relieved, the manager is happy that he wasn't hurt much. He tells Estio to go back and says he can submit the report in up to 3 days, but the messenger calls their attention again and says it will be a complicated situation. The manager asks what is so complicated. He just asked a guild member to rest after completing a request. The messenger opens his wings inside the room. Estio confuses him with an angel upon seeing his pair of wings. The messenger then announces that Estio must go with him to headquarters. Still admiring those wings, Estio is left speechless. Then the messenger says they have to go right now. Without wasting any time, they get into a carriage. Estio is being taken to the headquarters. On the way, he remembers the conversation he had with manager Galatian. He responds that he cannot refuse the decisions of the headquarters while he is still part of the organization. Sighing, the manager says that this is true. Estio feels very grateful and also feels sorry for the manager, but he is happy to have found another place to go. While he is resting, Ahuru says he has understood something. Estio opens his eyes and looks at him. Clarifying, Ahuru says that he understands what is wrong with Estio. He doesn't know how to say no and is always obedient to the will of others. Ahuru advises him to always say no when he doesn't want or hates something. The messenger asks what's wrong with Estio. Since he can't hear Ahuru, he certainly has reason to be concerned. And while ignoring Ahuru, our protagonist responds that it's nothing. Even after thinking so much without sleeping, Estio ignores his advice, making him irritated. Estio speaks curtly, telling Ahuru to be quiet. After seeing him talking to a plant, the messenger becomes curious. He asks if Estio can talk to plants, and he says yes. Impressed, the messenger asks Estio to demonstrate his powers by reading his mind. But our protagonist finds the messenger irritating. While resting, Neju adjusts herself on the carriage's sofa. She grunted a little while she slept. Estio looks at the messenger and starts reading his mind. Having been startled by Neju, the Birdman withdraws. He looks at Neju, feeling both admiration and fear of being devoured, while Estio reads his thoughts and speaks aloud. Amazed by our protagonist, the Birdman thinks he should have asked before. Having his feelings of embarrassment revealed, the messenger screams and apologizes to him. Estio asks if he is still curious, and the messenger says no and that he can stop. Neju had woken up from the Birdman's scream. Noticing this, Estio tells Neju she can still sleep more because they have a long way to go. She then asks our protagonist if he has already slept. Estio replies that he slept a little. Seeing his tired face, Neju tells him to sleep with her as his pillow. When he refuses, Neju grabs him, and she puts him on her shoulder. Estio thanks Neju for her comfortable shoulder. Seeing that the messenger was curious, he asks him what he wants to say. Without hesitation, he says that the three of them seem like a family. They were suffering from rain on the way. Because it was night, he asks if Estio is not cold and says he can raise the temperature if he prefers. Even with all the messenger's generosity and offering another blanket or something to eat, Estio says he is already very comfortable. He starts comparing it to the attic he used to live in and thinks that this carriage is much more comfortable. Suddenly, he misses the sweets in the manager's office. The rain continues to fall without stopping. The carriage protected them from all the rain. Estio watches the raindrops dripping on the glass. Ahuru realizes that this is the perfect weather for telling ghost stories. Still awake, Estio sees Ahuru wanting to tell stories. He pokes one of his spines while thinking that humans are scarier than ghosts. Suddenly, the messenger moves during his sleep and starts snoring very loudly. Perplexed, Estio cannot believe what he is seeing. Then Neju's ears hear something. She wakes up immediately after hearing the noise. Noticing Neju wake up, Estio tells her that if she woke up from the snoring, she can go back to sleep. Neju says she heard something approaching the carriage, but it wasn't human or animal, and she had a strong bad feeling. She immediately opens the carriage door and warns that a horde of monsters has appeared, and they are completely surrounded. As he wakes up, the messenger asks how many enemies there are. The soldier says they are harpies with high compatibility. Harpies are monsters that should not appear in winter, which surprises the messenger when hearing about the monsters. The soldier says he doesn't know why the harpies have awakened, but they cannot escape because the horses are not fast enough. Neju says she will help fight these monsters. Estio was going to tell her to wait, but she quickly leaves the carriage before that. She tells Estio to stay and wait in the carriage, but he doesn't know what to say being left behind like that. The rain seems to have stopped, but the sky is still cloudy. Apprehensive, the guard is still nervous even with Estio's partner going to fight the harpies alone. The Birdman says he is just a mailman and has no compatibility. Estio gets up from the carriage and says he will help. The mailman says that Estio is not the fighting type either. He agrees but says he has no intention of fighting the harpies. Estio's cold gaze makes his body tremble. Noticing that Estio's gaze is different from before, he becomes a bit worried. If Estio had no intention of fighting, he thinks that Estio wanted to become harpy food along with his friend. After realizing his intentions, he goes after Estio to inform him. Harpies are wild beasts that move in groups. Unlike avians like him, harpies are not enemies that can be defeated with brute force alone. He asks Estio to listen to this and not get himself killed after dealing with a few harpies. Meanwhile, Neju is fighting the harpies alone. He suggests they flee while they are not being massacred, but something from above alerts him. He sees a harpy flying above them. She looks down and sees her prey, heading directly for the avian. Frightened, He can't think of dodging. He prepares for the collision with the harpy, but not feeling the pain of the blow, he opens his eyes to see STO had jumped in front of him, blocking the monster's attack. The harpy was attacking STO's shoulder. It seemed like she was biting his shoulder instead of pecking. Worried about him, the messenger screams in horror. The blood from STO's wound was dripping. The fragrance entered the harpy's nostrils. Even the other harpies that were not fighting looked more closely. Then all the monsters gathered. The harpy attacks him fiercely again. Neju punches the same one that was attacking STO with all her strength. Her attack easily disoriented it, sending it flying with Neyu's strength. Worried, she asks if STO is okay. Even while bleeding, he responds that he is. She asks about the blood he is losing. Compared to his life, he says is nothing. The messenger thanks him for saving his life. The other harpies begin to attack. Neju warns that more of them are coming. Thoughtfully, STO wonders if he can handle this against several monsters. Then he activates his power. His blue eyes shine and he orders the harpies to stop moving. The activation of his power even affected the trees. The harpies stopped moving in the air, and he questions whether he should kill them, but he decides to send them away. They all start flying back to their nest. The messenger wonders how he did that. It was the first time he saw a monster obey a human's orders. STO tells them to return to the carriage. Neju says he is as kind as ever. Though a bit apprehensive, the messenger decides to go too. They ignore leaving behind an unconscious harpy. After that, the night became quiet again. The messenger still questioned how the group of harpies had left so quickly. Seeing STO's feats, he wondered why the headquarters was looking for him. Getting into the carriage, he asks Neju to be careful. STO asks if she was hurt in the fight. While looking at STO, the messenger thought he was a dangerous being. It was still night, but the sky was clearer. The carriage could be seen under the moonlight. Suki says that STO is annoying. He woke up in the middle of his sleep and sees Suki in his cat form on top of him. He tells STO to go back to sleep and not wander around getting bitten by monsters again. He apologizes for being careless. Suki tells STO not to apologize and to stay out of trouble, so he doesn't feel the need to apologize to him. While dozing off, STO looks at Suki on his lap. With his back turned, Suki asks him not to hurt anyone. The next day, the carriage was moving again. Ahuru was happy with another beautiful morning. He wakes up STO, who was lying on the sofa. Then it is noticed that roots had grown under Ahuru's pot. Standing up, STO asks if he knows how to walk now. Jokingly, Ahuru asks if he is shocked to see a cactus walking out of nowhere right after waking up. He says he was also surprised. Then a shadow covers him. It was Neju, who was excited to see Ahuru walking. She congratulates the two, and they greet each other. Still quite sleepy, a messenger wakes up. He sees Ahuru and Neju playing together, and says that STO's friends are quite peculiar. Even seeing a cactus walking doesn't surprise him as much. After all, scaring off a flock of harpies is more impressive to him. Then he remembers the events of the previous night. Staring at STO, he imagines that it wouldn't be so surprising if he had a dragon as his ally. The messenger stretches as he gets up. Seeing the messenger's wings, STO says they are cool. This comment embarrasses him but also makes him a little happy. They continued on their way on the dirt road. They were having breakfast when STO thought of Ahuru. He was walking around the carriage, enjoying being able to move. STO asks if he needs water to feed himself, but he replies that he doesn't because he's already full. Curious, STO asks if he has already eaten. Then Ahuru starts explaining, asking our protagonist about the injury from the previous night. STO listens attentively to what he will say. Ahuru asks if he wasn't bleeding a lot since the wound on his shoulder was very large. Remembering, he says he was indeed bleeding a lot. The blood was running down STO's body until it splashed on Ahuru. Then he says he drank some of the blood he shed. The atmosphere becomes a bit too quiet when STO hears this. He lifts Ahuru from the ground and asks to confirm if he really drank his blood. Ahuru says yes. Neju and the messenger only hear STO talking to himself since they can't hear Ahuru. Agitated, Ahuru asks STO not to get things confused as he didn't drink his blood on purpose. Besides being able to move more freely, a flower also grew on his head. Expressionless, STO looks at him and asks if the flower grew after he drank his blood. In his mind, the messenger says that STO should be more worried about the fact that a normal plant drank his blood and learned to walk because of it. Then Ahuru gives the flower that grew to STO as a gift. Happily, he thanks him for the flower he received. Ahuru says that he should be the one thanking him. Suddenly, the flower begins to glow with a golden light. Then the flower disintegrates on his arm and starts to disappear with its traces. The two become extremely sad with the gift that vanished. Surprised, Ahuru starts looking at STO's arm. Now the flower's light started to shine on his arm. Everyone began to look at the glowing arm. Slowly, the light starts to fade, and STO touches his wound to check it. He removes the dressings and bandages and discovers that the flower had healing properties. Very happy, Ahuru begins to boast. STO asks Neju if she saw Suki visiting them the previous night. She replies that Suki had been with them since last night in the carriage. Now he seems to be lying on top of the carriage. STO begins to reflect that the event of the previous night was not a dream. He puts his clothes back on and opens the moving carriage door. He leans out and stands outside. Worried, the messenger says it's dangerous to do that with a moving carriage. Estio tries to talk to Suki, as he knows he is up there. Then Suki appears when called. Because it is dangerous to stay on top of the carriage, Estio asks him to come inside. Unconcerned, Suki sits looking at him. He starts by saying that Estio is more dangerous than he is now. Then he jumps into the carriage. Estio closes the door and the messenger is surprised to see a cat. Confused, he asks if Estio is raising this cat. Denying his question, Estio says that Suki is not a cat with an owner, but he is also not a stray cat. The messenger thinks to himself that it must be another of Estio's friends. Suki asks who the man is, and our protagonist introduces him by the name of Parker. Resting his head on Estio's leg, he asks if his wound is better. He replies that thanks to Oharu's help, he was healed. Curious, Suki asks what cactus can do. Estio says it was a healing ability. When he was about to say something about Suki following him, he says he wasn't following him and just saw him injured while he was traveling. Given the situation, Estio asks the cat to travel with him from now on. His tail stops out of hesitation. He begins to remember when Estio held him in his arms, and he felt a warm embrace. Because of this, Suki says he will continue following him only because he asked. Knowing his emotions, Estio thanks him. Suki realizes that he has changed, but says to himself that this change is not bad. Finally, the carriage stops and everyone arrives at their destination. Parker calls Estio to look at the portal that connects to the headquarters. It had a golden border and its inside was a mix of red, violet, and purple colors. The guard identified their identity and says that for security reasons, the portal can only be used 3 times a day. Estio can hear the side effects of the portal crossing as he looked at one for the first time in front of him. He walks slowly towards it and begins to cross it without speaking to Parker. He closes his eyes due to the sudden light on his face and opens them again as he gets used to the light. He was in front of the headquarters. The others followed behind after he entered. Parker welcomes Estio to the headquarters. He climbed a spiral staircase in the middle. Estio felt as if he were walking to the sky on an infinite staircase. As he climbed, he began to wonder if paradise was really in the sky, the people with power and wealth, and the people who help them. He wonders if things will get better if he keeps climbing. Shaking his head, he pushes those thoughts away. Finally, they reach the top of the staircase. Estio says it was quite quick. Parker responds that the staircase is like a portal and also says that Estio should meet the guild master, but he has been absent for almost 3 months. Instead, it was decided that he would meet the vice master in his place. When he finally reached the office door, Parker presses its doorbell. There are a few moments of silence while they wait. Then he realizes why it is taking so long. Parker says the vice master is sleeping again. Confused, Estio asks if he is really sleeping. Impatiently, Parker starts pressing the doorbell repeatedly. The door opens abruptly from the inside, nearly hitting Oharu, but Estio pulls him away carefully. They are stunned by the door opening. Oharu starts to react, realizing that his head could have been taken off by the door. Curious, Estio wonders where Cactus's head is. The vice master appears holding a sword. Yawning, he asks who is interrupting his sleep. Noticing Parker in front of him, he looks at him. Saying he didn't order chicken from room service, Parker repeats to the vice master that he is not food. Oharu mocks him for not denying the chicken part. Parker gives up on him and finally says he'd brought a guest. The vice master is curious about what guest he has. He doesn't remember inviting anyone and asks if no one is working downstairs. Saying he will cut his salary for waking him up, Parker becomes very irritated with him. The vice master tells him to leave so he can go back to sleep. But a meow catches his attention. Then he sees Suki meowing. He kneels to take a closer look, praising the cat's cuteness. When he's about to pet the cat's head, it turns away and walks over to Estio, who was waiting. Parker introduces Estio as the member of their Galasia branch. The vice master stands up upon seeing him. He says that Parker called him a guest, but actually brought the leader of his guild. When Lesky introduces himself to Estio as the vice master, they shake hands and Lesky says he is finally meeting the leader from the rumors. Estio is curious why he is being called leader. Lesky then invites them into his room, a completely disorganized place despite the beautiful furniture. Incredulous, Oharu calls this place a pigsty. Neju worries that if he enters, he will end up stepping on things. Lesky enters and tells him not to worry, since he doesn't mind if they step on his things. Noticing that Neju speaks very well, he asks if he is also half-human. Surprised, Neju asks how he knew, but Lesky says it was a guess. He kneels to Neju's height and says that it was actually a joke. Lesky says that supposing he were an animal, he would want to learn to speak the human language to converse with other humans. Estio consents that Lesky is a very different person inside and out. He offers a coffee, but Estio politely declines. And apologizing to our protagonist, Lesky thinks he might be at the age where he doesn't like bitter things and thinks chocolate might be better. In his mind, Estio says he didn't refuse because of the bitterness. The coffee and chocolate are ready after a while. On the table, there were also some cookies to accompany them. He receives a mug of hot chocolate. Lesky comments that the leader is still quite young. Estio says he has already had his coming-of-age ceremony, but Lesky responds that a true adult doesn't retort when called young but thanks. Parker catches the vice master's attention. Curious, Lesky asks what it is. He responds that he seems like an old pervert who likes to play with children, so it would be better to stop that behavior. Shaken by this comment, he starts talking seriously and says it was the guild master's decision to summon the leader to the headquarters. Estio understands but is still in doubt. Why is he called leader? Lesky says it was the master's decision to name him that and he is just passing on what he was told. He doesn't know the exact requirements to become one either. These words don't provide answers to Parker and Estio's confusion. Estio begins to wonder if the guild is a trustworthy place. They act overly secretive, and their stance on things changes constantly, but despite all this, they still haven't lied. Estio can use his powers to notice this, and feels a bit more relieved. Lesky warns him that he will be in charge of different missions than before. Estio asks how different they will be. He responds that they will be special missions that only the leader can do. Then a smile appears on his face. After explaining that the special missions can only be completed if the leader does them, Estio becomes thoughtful about the origin of this new nickname. Something is thrown onto the table between them. A pouch containing a gift for his promotion. The tag had Estio's name on it. Lesky says that inside are his new uniform, emblem, and other things like supplies and coins. Meiju starts to peek inside the pouch. Then he says there's something else, but it's just out of his curiosity. It has nothing to do with the guild master. Leaving Estio confused, Lesky says he was curious about the power that made the leader so famous, and he asks for a demonstration. Estio remains quiet for a moment. He picks up his sword that was next to the sofa. In another moment, Lesky is feeling powerless, kneeling on the ground. He can only laugh at his situation. Estio's hot chocolate was put back on the table. The other mug had fallen to the ground, spilling coffee. Lesky considers himself a fool for having considered fighting Estio. The moment he picked up his sword to test his strength, he launched a surprise attack on him. Surprised, Estio did not react to his attack. Confused, Lesky wonders why he is not defending himself. Suddenly, a sword appears with its blade at his neck, but Estio had not even moved from his place. Then he realizes that he himself was holding his sword to his own neck. He couldn't move. Estio says he heard Lesky wanting to see his power. With his eyes glowing, he asks if that demonstration was sufficient. Losing his strength, Lesky falls to his knees on the ground, dropping his sword. Crossing his legs on the table, feeling awful just remembering that he lost without even fighting, he curses the guild master for not explaining better to him. Estio is more of a dictator than a leader. Wondering how the master expects him to contain someone stronger than him, Lesky feels that not being devoured will already be a blessing, but a smile appears on his face. He becomes excited to see that a new era has begun. After walking through the guild building's corridors, Ahuru becomes extremely happy to see a new pot. Quickly, he jumps into the new pot, changing homes. Estio says it's great that Ahuru liked his new gift. He starts looking around the room. It was a very chic room belonging to a noble. They even had cat houses for Tsuki and a bed for Neiju. And the porcelain decorations in the room were very beautiful. Estio thought they didn't need to prepare all this for him. Excited, Neiju shows Estio the new clothes he had received. Besides boots and other clean sets of clothes, Neiju tells him that they are not just clothes. According to the paper he is reading, they were coated with magic, possessing self-cleaning properties, temperature control, shock absorption, and among many other things. Estio begins to wonder if Neiju wants to start wearing clothes too. He asks Neiju to wait a bit, saying he will go out to see if he can find clothes that fit him and Tsuki. Neiju and Tsuki say they don't need clothes, but Estio says they might get cold or feel embarrassed to walk around naked. Tsuki says now, and he's driving him crazy. Tsuki explains that since they have fur, they don't need clothes. Neiju starts to explain that people need to wear good clothes to receive good treatment. That's what humans call status. This was the first time Estio heard of this word. He wondered if it would be better if he had status. Responding to him, Neiju says that people will like him more if he has status. Estio questions if having a high status will make others like someone more. After all, not everyone likes the king. Neiju responds that at least people won't be able to attack him publicly. He says he will protect Estio, but it will be a problem if people stronger than Neiju threaten him. Neiju remembers when he lost his mother. Estio remains silent in response. He kneels and raises his hands to him, placing his hands on Neiju's collar. Removing the collar, he says he will leave it off while no one is around because being chained all the time must be uncomfortable. Neiju says the chains don't bother him when he walks, so he wasn't bothered. But Estio says he feels uncomfortable seeing him wear that. Supi jumps down for Estio's shoulder. Estio thanks Neiju for bringing him the clothes and for being happy for him, and he says that she doesn't need to worry anymore. Realizing that his ability is getting stronger, Estio discovers that he can now make anyone kneel before him. Even that strengthened soldier from the Fabian house was no match for him, and even harpies had no control of their bodies. Estio feels that it is quite convenient. Clenching his hand, he realizes he is a more selfish human being than he thought. Parker appears in the dining hall, announcing that Estio has a request. He hands him a letter with the guild seal, interrupting his meal. Estio thanks Parker. A feather falls into his soup. Parker says he is paid to make deliveries and asks if he has gotten used to the headquarters. He was getting bored with the comfort, but now Estio feels relieved to have received a request. Emotionally, Parker begins to call Estio by his new nickname Leader and says he is very diligent. Estio invites him to have lunch with him and Parker accepts. Even though they call him leader, Estio doesn't exactly know what he has to do. So he opens the request information and reads the name Higer in the letter. Ahuru says he recognizes that name. It's from a new family of dukes in the nation. The head of the Mubian family is the son of the current emperor and possesses incredible physical abilities. Estio asks if Ahuru has met him, and he has answered yes. Curious, Neju asks what Ahuru said to him. Estio says that Ahuru has already met their next client. Neju begins to praise the cactus, saying it is an amazing plant. Ahuru thanks her and also says that Neju is amazing. Then he says that the Mubian he knows is a bit crazy. Ahuru says he doesn't know much, but he knows his swordsmanship is very good. Estio asks if he is just strong, but Ahuru says no. Mubian is very strong after all. Before becoming the head of the family, he defeated a well-known swordsman with a single blow. Moreover, he also triumphed against many monsters and defeated everyone. Assimilating the information, Estio realizes that even someone as strong as this makes requests to the guild. Parker returned with his plate of food to have lunch with Estio. Our protagonist says that he will like it, but Ahuru notices feathers in the soup and warns Estio. He pats the cactus's head and Parker looks confused. A while after they finish eating, Estio starts reading the request description. As he expected, there weren't many specific details. Estio asks if Parker is done. He says yes, then gets up and leaves. Apprehensively, Parker looks at Estio. He comments that he has noticed Estio is a very reserved person. Estio asks him what he meant by that. Memories of people calling him a monster and expelling him return to his mind. Then Estio begins to remember that it's been a while since the last time he ate with someone else. Walking through the guild corridors, Estio walks at a calm pace, and Parker follows right behind. Apprehensive, Estio stops moving. He turns to look at Parker and asks if he still has work at the headquarters. Parker replies that the letter he had just delivered was his last request, and he has nothing else to deliver for now. Estio asks if he was given a break. Parker says no. This confuses him. Noticing that Estio seems not to have been informed yet, Parker asks to be sure if he knew what the superiors had told him. He asks what they said. Parker replies that he has now been transferred to his team. Confused, Estio asks about the team. Proudly, Parker says that he will now be part of the leader's support team. This means that he is now Estio's subordinate, and Parker raises his hand for a handshake. Hesitating, Estio says he understands what he said. They shake hands as he thinks about the unexpected way he gained a team member and a subordinate simultaneously. Estio begins to see himself as a leader, as his nickname suggests. Parker worries that he might have overwhelmed him too much. Then Estio says that first they need to pack their bags. Curious, Parker asks where they are going. Estio says they are going to meet the client Mubian R. Higar. They appear again at the teleportation portal. Parker arrives at the portal and says it's just as he thought. While carrying a huge suitcase on his back, he asks if camping equipment will be necessary. Estio and Neju stare at him uncomfortably for carrying such a heavy suitcase. Estio says they won't be camping, but Parker says he brought snacks. He shows salted crackers and baked lemon baguettes. Those were limited edition snacks that he bought with his own money, and he was willing to share them with Estio because he is the leader. But our protagonist politely declines. This leaves Parker tearing up with sadness. Then the portal guard informs them that Higer's territory is out of their reach, so he will have to send them to the Renox underground cave. Parker is concerned about the part about being an underground cave. The guard activates the portal and wishes them a good trip. Estio and the others walk to the portal and cross it. Already used to it, he just walks through the portal. Parker can't help but feel scared of going underground like that. Afraid of being left behind, he runs after them, asking them to wait for him. They exit safely inside the cave. He keeps looking around in fear. Then a voice comes from behind Parker, scaring him a lot. He opens his wings to fly, but hits his head on the cave ceiling, knocking himself out. Everyone looks at the fallen Parker. The bump on his head was making him see stars. The older man says that Parker is quite an energetic pigeon. Then he introduces himself as the portal manager. Estio asks if they are in the Renox underground cave. Surprised by Estio's politeness, he comments aloud. He says that no one has visited this cave for a long time, so he asks what they are doing there. Estio replies that they are heading to Higer's territory. The portal manager warns that there are hardly any adventurers who go to that land of death. Intrigued by this comment, Estio asks why Higer's territory is called that. Answering him, he says that the Emperor did not want to keep his talented cousin close to him since he was someone who surpassed him in everything. The manager asks a rhetorical question about how much of a nuisance he would be to the Emperor. Then he points to a path in the dark cave. He says that even though it is the only base connected to Higer, no one knows what is there. Parker, curious, asks why no one knew. The manager says that means he will let them pass but will not guarantee their safety, leaving Parker scared. The territory that the Emperor gave to the Duke was a land full of deadly monsters. Summarizing the Emperor's story, the manager says that the kitty was just scared and very afraid of his own cousin. While hiding behind Estio, he sees the manager laughing at his own joke. Estio starts looking around, and then looks back at the manager. He realizes that he is neither scared nor disturbed. Then Estio begins to use his powers. The manager approaches them, warning Estio to be careful, and tells him to do his best not to attract the attention of the fearful king, unless he wants to be devoured before even cracking the shell of his egg. Estio asks him to pass a message to the emperor. He will gladly accept his welcome, and that when the time comes, he can speak freely with him without the need to hide. Then he walks straight, disappearing into the cave's shadows. The manager stood silent. Then he starts laughing uncontrollably. He repeats Estio's words, "Speak freely without the need to hide." The old man begins to peel off his skin mask, and a young appearance is revealed. Magic lamps light up and illuminate the cave. Estio and his friends walk cautiously. Parker shakes his head, showing that he is very nervous. Seeing the frightened look on his companion's face, Estio timidly apologizes for not knowing he was afraid of underground caves. Parker asks how he knew, but then he remembers that Estio can read his mind. Estio apologizes for doing so without asking for permission, but Parker reassures him, saying that it's not a problem since he is the leader. Parker says it's not fear, but a racial trait. This information intrigues Estio, who wants to know more. Avians are a race that normally lives in high mountains and hills. Because of this, they feel uncomfortable in places where their freedom to fly is taken away. That's why Parker's reaction was that of a scared person. In a narrow place like this, his race has difficulties. Since this tunnel is directly connected to the Haggard territory, Estio says it shouldn't take more than half a day of walking to reach their destination. He took the liberty of choosing the path through the cave due to the daily limitations of using the portal. This method is certainly more efficient, but Estio says it's his fault for choosing alone without consulting his team members. Parker disagrees, saying that he is the leader and the leader only needs to give orders. Upon hearing the word orders, Estio hesitates. He asks if Parker will follow his orders regardless of his will. Hearing Parker's confirmation, Estio thinks this is no different from controlling his mind. Unconcerned, Parker says it's not against his will. He's here because he wanted to follow Estio. After all, not only is Estio his superior, but he was also the one who saved his life. Estio responds that he only did it because his life was in danger too. But even so, Parker thanks him, as he would have died if it weren't for Estio. While they were talking, Neju sensed something ahead. His growl made Parker afraid. The sound of monsters could be heard from the dark front of the cave. Estio asks Neju to confirm, and he responds that there are several monsters, and they are fast. Hearing this conversation, Parker gets scared. He asks how close the monsters are. Neju says they are right below, and the ground begins to crack at that very moment. The yellow creature reveals its form. Recognizing that silhouette, Parker stammers as he says the monster's name. Finally discovered by the earth, it is revealed to be earthworms. Confused, Estio wonders if they are giant worms. Horu gets excited because it's the first time he has seen these monsters. He says that as long as they don't attack first, the worms won't be aggressive. Using his two little arms to gesture, Horu points at them, saying they are just watching. The earthworms remain in the same hole they came out of, without attacking. And to add, Horu says they have no reason to attack. They are neither carnivores nor herbivores. Curious, Estio asks what they eat, and he responds that it's dirt. With its mouth open, the worm puts some dirt into its mouth. Then it starts chewing the dirt. Estio and Neju watch this scene disinterestedly. But Parker's reaction is still that of a scared person. Horu teases him, calling him a little crying chicken, even though he cannot be heard. After some time observing the worms, Estio says they are letting them pass. Crying, Parker asks if they aren't going to eat them, but they respond that the worms probably don't eat humans. Without fear, he walks in a straight line. And to calm his companions, he says they were just curious because it had been a long time since someone crossed this path. Surprised, Estio says he heard them say they were responsible for the construction of this cave. After passing, he calls Parker to come to his side too. But Parker was still very afraid of being swallowed by the worms. They still squirm without having any idea of the young avian's thoughts. His body trembled just by being close to them. Seeing his friend's difficulty, Estio thought of helping him. But Parker says he doesn't need help. He was just going to ask the little monsters to move to the side, but it seems he missed that chance. Crossing that bed of worms proved to be a difficult task. In the end, Parker and Neju got completely dirty with dirt and monster droppings. Estio says it doesn't smell that bad, but Parker disagrees. Seeing Parker's lying face, he realizes that even a powerful ability user like Estio cannot lie. After passing the earthworms, Parker realizes he misinterpreted the information about the Rinox underground cave. The story is that there aren't many visitors because there are monsters that attack people. But even though the worms smelled bad and were strange, they still behaved nicely. Estio asks if he is still afraid even knowing they won't attack. Parker responds that they are so disgusting that they are scary. Unlike Parker, he says he found the worms cute, climbing up to where they were just to see them and wriggling their large bodies. It has been 3 hours since they entered the cave. Parker supposes they must be close to their destination and says he wants to get rid of the bad smell as quickly as possible. Sensing a fresh water scent, Neju says there is water nearby. He points in a direction where he can feel clean water and hear the sound of a waterfall. At the end of the cave, there is a bright opening. Entering deeper into it, they can see a waterfall inside the cave. When they encounter the waterfall in front of them, they are fascinated by the place and decide to approach it. Estio kneels, taking some of that water in his hands, and confirming that it is clean. He warns his companions to be careful, just in case, completely ignored by Niju, who then jumps into the water without a second thought. The group, who were apprehensive because they didn't know if there was any danger there, now breathes a sigh of relief, seeing that they really seem to be safe. Neju calls Estio to join him in the water, and Parker reminds him that he should take this moment to bathe the cat as well, who doesn't seem very happy with the idea because he doesn't like water. But since he might even get sick, Parker keeps insisting on the idea of a bath while Suki listens to everything and curses the boy, calling him a damn pigeon. With no choice, Suki decides to bathe on his own, even against his will. But before he could put his paws in the water, he is suddenly grabbed by something that pulls him up, making him end up in Parker's arms, ready for a dive. He uses his super flying dive technique and plunges into the waterfall with the cat in his arms. Estio, who was also entering the water, notices that after diving, his cat is now perched on top of Parker's head, with his face submerged in the water. Quickly, he runs out of the water and hides behind Estio near the entrance of the waterfall. The cat, furious with the pigeon for what he had done, starts complaining, and Estio says that at least his fur is clean now and begins to dry him off. Meanwhile, Parker gets up and asks Suki if he liked the surprise which threatened his life while being held in the protagonist's arms. Estio warns that Suki was startled by his behavior and that he needs to apologize to him because of that, promising not to do that again without the cat's consent. Parker awkwardly apologizes, putting his hand on his head, saying that next time he will warn him about the super dive before doing it. And Estio reminds the group that they should get back on the road because they have no time to lose. At that moment, Ahuru tries to draw attention to himself, saying he is thirsty, and the boy responds by saying there's water right next to him. But apparently that doesn't please the little cactus, who seems to want something else to feed on. Estio then asks what it could be, and Ahuru explains that it's something stronger with a unique and delicious texture, making the boy wonder how the cactus's diet had changed in recent days. While he thinks about it, Ahuru then decides to place his hand on his companion, asking him to raise his spines. The cactus doesn't quite understand at first, but he follows his orders anyway. And pricking the boy's hand, blood begins to drip into his pot. Parker, who was approaching Estio bringing his cloak, asks what he was doing when he sees this scene in front of him. Estio informs him that he's just feeding the cactus, and that his companion doesn't need to worry about the bleeding in his hand. With Ahuru satisfied, they head out while talking about who might have made that waterfall. Parker assumes that the place wasn't created by the worms, but by another being that once lived there. Estio asks why he thinks that, and Parker explains that caves like that usually already have owners living inside. For example, tigers, wolves, or even dragons. The protagonist, not knowing much about the subject, asks curiously if dragons also live in caves, and Parker continues giving details, also informing that the body of a dragon is much larger than the cave, making it unlikely that one of these creatures lived there before. He also mentions the two forms that the strongest dragons among the draconic beings possess, one being the creature's known form and the other that of an ordinary human. Estio, surprised, asks if Parker was really saying that dragons lived transformed as humans in the past, unable to believe it. And Parker continues his explanation, saying that it was as if these creatures had two bodies, being a race truly loved by God. As the sacred scripture said that the form of man was the form of God, dragons also had a second form that was created based on the divine form. But to truly confirm all of this, they first needed to find one. Estio was unaware of all this because he had never been to a religious temple before, which surprises Parker because, in his view, all villagers should have a small place of worship in their homes. The protagonist explains that he lived in a very poor place in a mountain town, and even though the inhabitants of his city were loved by God, in the end, it didn't really matter. Because no matter how strong they were, they all ended up being extinct without leaving a single trace behind. Parker corrects the boy, saying he seems to have misunderstood the information, explaining that it was actually the opposite. The dragons themselves had abandoned this world and gone to another place. And although they were called guardians, these creatures were the top predators of the food chain, with no one powerful enough to subjugate them. Estio asks if they hadn't been killed by humans, feeling confused with all the new information. And Parker replies that it wasn't possible. The real reason was actually the unstoppable progress that humans possessed, leading to many subsequent wars because of it. The dragons, who observe everything, wept as they watched their world become corrupted until God decided to give them one last choice. The creatures could either stay as guardians or leave this planet and go to another home by their own will, which ended up being their choice. None of this was truly proven, only told through the sacred scriptures that he knew. The only thing truly proven was the love that God had for dragons, possibly even greater than his love for humans. And suddenly, Neju interrupts the two, saying that something was coming towards the group. Clenching his teeth, he says that the new creatures weren't as friendly as the worms, having bad intentions. In the darkness of the cave, they see something moving and some paws start to appear, revealing a pack of cave wolves in front of them, who seemed irritated. Parker, scared, says that they were probably just passing by. But Huru, without lowering his guard, informs Estio that the creatures seemed more sensitive at the moment due to the hunger they felt. While they were talking, trying to analyze the situation for a possible confrontation, one of the wolves appears above them, already making the first move. Neju knocks out some wolves, holding the cactus in his hands, while the rest of them had already surrounded the group from all sides. Then one of them charges, aiming for his blind spot. But with his instincts awakened, he perceives the wolf's movement behind him and turns, ready, swinging his left arm towards the animal's head. He hits it squarely and ends up with blood on his claws. The wolves stare at him, seeing what had happened to one of their own. And Estio takes advantage of this moment of distraction to counterattack with his power. The wolves then sit by his side while Neju runs towards him, pleased with his leader's action. Estio seems unwilling to sacrifice the wolves there for nothing, discovering that they lived in a pack. Instead, he takes possession of the pack's leadership, causing the wolves to howl towards their new commander. After a long sign of respect from the wolves, they bow to the group, accepting them as their superiors, who then decide to head towards their destination. Right after finally cleaning themselves in the waterfall, Neju was already dirty again because of all that. But he didn't care, because to solve the problem, he just needed to clean himself again. Parker and Neju introduce themselves to each other to get to know one another better, while Estio, a bit further ahead, finally seems to have found the exit. A small opening in the cave shows some trees on the other side in an open grassy field. Looking ahead, Parker is amazed by what he sees. A giant white castle with blue details at its tips and an entrance gate in the center, pointing towards the adventurers. They wonder if they've arrived in the territory of Hygar. The place, which was so large that it almost looked like a small city, also had some guards armed with spears spread across its walls. Seeing some cannons ready to be used resting on the ground, Estio wonders if that place was really the territory of Hagar. The ground suddenly begins to tremble, making Parker think that an earthquake might be happening. But Neju, familiar with the situation, asks them to observe a detail, turning his head to the left as if pointing in a direction. A march of soldiers on horseback with flags raised high was advancing towards them. Many of them were soldiers, and a man who seemed to be the commander of that group approached, leading all the others. Parker, surprised by the number of soldiers in front of them, comments on the situation as they draw closer, asking Estio if he is the leader of the Ignis Guild, to which he then responds. The man informs that the Lord is expecting the boy to enter the city while being escorted by the guards. The workers who lived in the area, upon seeing this unfold, are astonished by the situation. And noticing that a member of the Ignis Guild was present, they are impressed with the group, which at first glance appears to be very strong. They then wonder why they had suddenly appeared. If it were for a battle, they would be ready to help the group immediately, and they begin to show how much they love the place they live in by raising their fists in the air, ready to fight to protect their city. This catches Estio's attention for some reason. He comments that the territory is wonderful, and the soldier questions what makes him feel that way about the place, to which he responds that it is because of the hearts of the people around him. Concluding his statement, he continues thinking and shares a bit about how he feels seeing the residents react in that way. It was something he would never do because he had never felt the desire to protect his homeland. Inside the palace, we finally see some chandeliers hanging from a ceiling far above them with a staircase below, and some windows with artwork of people forming a three-dimensional image from the protagonist's perspective. As they climb the stairs, the guard in front of them suddenly apologizes to the group, then says that from this point on, only their leader is allowed to continue, describing the rules of the place and how things work. With no choice, Estio decides to go alone to the meeting, which makes Neju uneasy about the situation, not wanting the group to be separated. But the boy tries to calm his companion, saying that he would try to be as quick as possible, asking them to wait for him just for a few moments and nothing more. Neju agrees, but makes it clear to Estio that if anything happens, he only needs to call out, staying alert for anything that might occur. Parker also chimes in, saying that he would take care of everything there. But before he can finish his sentence, Estio closes the entrance completely, leaving the pigeon literally talking to the door, not caring about his words. This makes Parker sad, and Neju now has to take care of him. Even worried about his companions being alone for the first time, he continues walking. Thinking about the situation, he starts deciding what to do when, out of nowhere, he is surprised by a Huru, who appears right in front of him, jumping nonstop. And seeing the cactus, he remembers that Neju used to hold his companion most of the time. But for some reason, at a specific moment, he had disappeared from his hands. While pondering this, he is interrupted by a man sitting at a table in front of him wearing glasses, who was holding something in his hands and asking if he didn't already know the boy. Estio approaches him, and they begin to converse until the cactus also catches the man's attention, appearing right beside him, introducing himself, saying his name and that he was a real cactus. The man, disturbed by the scene, tries to scream, But his desperation is so great that he chokes on his own voice the first time, and the second time he lets out all his despair with a scream that could be heard throughout the entire city. Ahuru also starts screaming back at the man because he ends up getting scared by his reaction, together turning the place into a complete mess. Seeing all of this, Estio closes his eyes and puts his hand on his head due to the situation that had suddenly gotten completely out of control. Some guards enter the place running, asking their lord what the problem was, which makes him regain his concentration as he looks at them, surprised. He then calms down and explains that nothing actually happened, asking them to return to their posts. The soldiers, not understanding anything, ignore the screams and obey the lord's order, returning to their places and closing the door of the place as they leave. The man then begins to talk to the cactus, thinking that the leader was actually him, and tries to start a conversation with Ahuru, still impressed by what he could do, even though he was just a plant. The cactus, indignant with the man in front of him, asks if the man was stupid, who simply ignores his insults, calling him rude. And seeing this person in front of him, Ahuru declares with full certainty that the idiot talking to him definitely couldn't be a duke. Estio interrupts the two and introduces himself as the true leader of the guild, asking about what he had mentioned earlier regarding already knowing him. The man then looks at him and claims that it was actually nothing. Continuing the conversation, the man says he wasn't aware that Estio could disguise himself as a cactus. Estio explains that, in fact, he hadn't done that, but is suddenly confronted as the man reveals his real doubt. Asking random questions, the man seemed to be trying to gather some information from the boy without him realizing it at first, showing himself to be quite intelligent. Because of this, Estio is surprised and questions how much the man already knows about his life. The man tries to change the subject, saying that it was just a guess, while analyzing the boy and noticing that his presence in the place was indeed significant. He then finally decides to introduce himself as Mubianar Hygar. After introducing himself, he extends his hand to greet him with a small black sword hanging at his waist. Estio also introduces himself on behalf of his guild, shaking Mubian's hand, who then mentions that he is curious about one thing, turning his gaze toward Ahuru. He is intrigued by the cactus, wanting to understand better what he inadvertently calls a monster. Hearing this, Ahuru gets irritated and starts chasing the man around the table, which leaves Mubian even more confused by the small creature. Estio calls his companion closer, extending his hand, and the cactus immediately runs towards him, obeying his command. He asks the Duke if he could also hear what Ahuru was saying at that moment, to which Mubian naturally replies yes, then counters his question by asking why he wouldn't be able to do that. Estio, with this, presumes that Mubian has a similar ability to his own, but Mubian informs him that he doesn't actually have such an ability, adding that he doesn't even know what the boy is talking about, and that if he had heard it, his sword might have been understandable, because he had carried it for a long time. Estio, not understanding the reason for this, becomes curious about the information. The Duke explains that some connections grow stronger through blood, and he considers the possibility that the cactus might have ingested his leader Estio's blood earlier, finally deducing what happened there. He then begins to explain that it was definitely Estio's power that allowed the plant to be heard by others, and these abilities could be activated in various ways, but if enough blood was consumed, you wouldn't even need to ask a cactus to do anything. Surprised by all of this, Estio responds to the man, who seemed to know more about him than Estio himself, who now tries to clear up the misunderstanding by saying that he only had some information about the boy that had been gathered over the years. With this new information, Estio begins to wonder if other people might also have that ability registered. And Mubian promptly responds that there actually were, saying that it was all just a hypothesis, giving some information about traits that were passed down through his family over generations. Estio is confused by what he hears from the Duke, and suddenly Mubian draws his sword, pointing it at Estio, and then mentioning two specific characteristics: black eyes and a monstrous ability. With the speculation among the people in the place, it was rumored that the Hygar family might be direct descendants of the Black Dragons. Ahuru, upon hearing the man's words, isn't surprised at all, saying that it was actually the man's ego that was too big. The man, hearing this, tries to say something but ends up putting his hand on his head as if he was starting to feel unwell. Seeing this, Estio asks what happened to the Duke, who responds that he could feel the essence of the Black Dragon awakening in his veins. The scene leaves Ahuru still uncertain about the man, urging them to leave quickly. Mubian then apologizes, saying that it was just a joke and that he wasn't a black dragon, with everything being just old rumors that existed. He explains that these rumors were also related to his request to the guild. Estio asks what that request was, and the Duke hands him a blue bag, informing that he would like Estio to find a true descendant of these dragons. The protagonist is taken by surprise by this request, while Mubian points his finger and continues his speech, saying that if the boy helped him for a month, that request would be considered fulfilled regardless of the final outcome, and then asking him to follow without worry. Estio is confused about the Duke embarking on an adventure, leaving his duties behind, but it seemed that he had already planned everything in advance. He also mentions that he isn't a combatant, leading Estio to ask if he would take a guard with them on the journey. The Duke responds that he doesn't need one, while highlighting the sword at his waist. because if they consider only swordsmanship, he was the best fighter in the entire empire. The more time Uhuru spends near the Duke, the more disgusted he feels, calling the man cringe with every phrase that comes out of his mouth. The Duke concludes his speech by warning that if anyone dared to interrupt his work, it would be they who should worry about their own safety, no matter who they were. He heads toward the door, and as he touches the doorknob, Estio, hearing his thoughts where the man even shows a willingness to face the Supreme Emperor, questions him, asking the real reason for that specific quest of his. And guessing that the boy had read his mind, excited by the idea, the Duke explains that the request wasn't from the Duke of that nation, but rather a more personal request from him. Estio now seems to understand his objectives better as the man reaffirms that his family wasn't of draconic lineage, but that there was indeed black dragon blood mixed in his family's DNA, because one of his ancestors had ingested it before gaining such powers. He then opens the door he was holding, finding Estio's group waiting on the other side, conversing among themselves, commenting on the similarities between the group and a cactus, which irritates Uhuru once again. Estio begins walking towards them, ready to start the journey, and asks the Duke what their first destination would be upon leaving. But confusingly, the man seems not to have a place in mind, saying that over the next month he would actually just be observing Estio. He then reveals that he is, in fact, the person from the Black Dragon lineage that he was searching for. The protagonist is surprised by that claim, and everyone falls silent for a moment upon hearing the Duke say that. He continues his story, stating that the natural powers of black dragons with shadow attributes are based on mental energy that dominates the desire for life. He explains that Estio's abilities were too similar to be mere coincidences. Estio finds it hard to believe what he is hearing, while the Duke admits that he only called him there because he assumed the connection he might have with the dragons. And with that said, he informs them that he will be accompanying their group for a month. Cutting the scene, we enter another location. We see someone searching for Mubian, who turns out to be a woman in a blue dress with long red hair. In what seems to be an image from Mubian's mind, we see someone approaching him to converse warmly. The person, who turns out to be the same woman from before, appears to be caring for the boy, who seems to trust her quite a bit. With the child in her arms, she begins to tell a story about the blood of dragons flowing in the boy's veins, which immediately piques his curiosity. Excited to share this, she explains that it was a gift from the Black Dragon, known to be the most noble and beautiful in the world. The boy confronts the woman, saying that his grandfather had told him a different story, about dragons no longer existing on that planet. She contradicts this theory, explaining that dragons could indeed have disappeared from there due to all the problems and complications that arose, but it was said that the dragon who shared its blood with their family had not yet completely left that world. And the proof of this was their family lineage, which had always possessed great strength because of it. The boy, with all his innocence, is fascinated to learn all this and asks if the dragon hadn't died of old age. And she explains that being the guardians of that place, they would neither age nor fall ill, making it impossible for one of them to die. And as she bids farewell to her son, who is getting ready for bed, she concludes the story by saying that he was certainly protecting everyone there from somewhere. Mubian doesn't believe her because he doesn't want to accept the fact that the dragon was really protecting them personally, because that would mean they were weak in the end. Compared to a dragon, humans were indeed too fragile, but if they lived diligently, continuing the legacy and history of their family, they would be the last evidence of a dragon's existence in this world. Curious since he was a child, Mubian then asks why that dragon decided to stay while all the others chose to leave. Smiling, she responds that it was because the creature's love for humans was too great. Mubian suddenly wakes from his sleep and rises in the camp, realizing that he was just experiencing a memory. He places his hand on his head. Estio, who is also awake, asks about the dream Mubian had as if he knew something. The Duke is startled that the boy was still awake at that hour, and Estio tells him that he had also just woken up like him. Not understanding how Estio had seen his dream, Mubian asks if he was talking in his sleep or something similar, but Estio explains that he had slept normally. Seeing the protagonist standing by the campfire, they continue to converse until Mubian begins to recall Jiria again for some reason. Although the woman and Estio were completely different, they still shared some similarities in their personalities, as could be noted. They resume their conversation, and Estio explains a bit more about his basic ability, which is the power to read the hearts of others. He mentions that when someone starts having a dream due to a significant memory, sometimes even against his will, he invades that person's dream. Knowing this, Mubian then connects the dots, realizing that Estio had witnessed everything he had imagined while asleep. Estio then compliments Mubian's mother on her incredible beauty, which seems to please the Duke, who appreciates the compliment for someone dear to him. He says that she was a very wise person, even though she was no longer present in this world. He then asks the boy if he wasn't going to go back to sleep since he had only rested for an hour. Estio responds that he suffers from insomnia, and recalling some disturbing scenes that troubled his mind. Mubian also says that he had slept enough, deciding not to close his eyes again that day. Everyone in the group except for the two of them is sprawled on the ground asleep around the campfire. Mubian continues talking a bit more with Estio about his dream and then about his stepmother named Jiria. She was his father's second wife, but he thought of her as his true mother since his biological mother had died shortly after giving birth to him. He refers to Jiraiya as his beloved little star, just as she used to call him when he was a child. Remembering this dear person, he seems to recall things he failed to accomplish in the past. He tells the story of the day when a monster invasion occurred. They suddenly appeared in the city with the fall of night, and while Mubian was searching for his stepmother, a blood-stained claw could be seen. He then says that everyone had died that night except for him. After that, he lies down on the ground feeling dejected and comments that if the dragon really exists, he would ask it what he needs to protect now that there is nothing left. Wishing he didn't have all that power, he seems to lament his life, saying that if everything was going to end like that, he would prefer the Hygar family lineage to disappear. Estio, noticing that Mubian's mind was full of thoughts, interrupts his train of thought by simply telling him to rest. After all, since there was nothing left to protect, he could at least take the opportunity to sleep peacefully from now on. And that if a person didn't sleep well, many futile thoughts like the ones Mubian was having would invade their mind. Hearing all this, Mubian begins to question a few things about the boy beside him, saying that the day's nightmares had finally ended. And trusting him, he recalls that the boy could hear the hearts of others, falling asleep shortly after and gaining even more understanding of what he had already discovered about Estio. The night passes and a new day dawns. As a meal is being prepared at the camp, Mubian wakes up again after managing to rest, and he is surprised by the boy's mental abilities, having slept for so many hours straight after a long period of his life in which that wasn't possible. Ahura approaches him upon noticing that Mubian had woken up and without wasting much time starts insulting the Duke as he hadn't taken a liking to him before. They exchange a few quick words while Parker approaches from the background calling everyone to eat, bringing some bowls of food in his hands. He informs them that today's dish would be corn soup with cheese and ham. But when Mubian receives his meal, he doesn't see any of the ingredients mentioned by the pigeon and asks what it really is. Parker then tells him that it's actually milk soup with potatoes, cheese, and broccoli. Changing the description entirely, leaving the Duke confused about Parker's cooking abilities, he asks Parker if what he made was just some kind of mush with whatever was left in his bag. But the pigeon denies it, saying that his 20 years as a cook wouldn't allow him to make something like that. Mubian, seeing the boy's appearance, curiously asks how old Parker is since he has 20 years of experience in the kitchen. Parker responds that he is 21 years old, having learned to cook in his first year of life, starting with making his own baby food. The cactus, contradicting Mubian's doubts, says that it makes total sense because by 1 year old, it could already fly around on their own. This prompts Parker to share a few more details about himself while proudly boasting about all his skills. Mubian cuts him off and then asks where the group's leader is. Parker, looking away and pretending not to know the answer, awkwardly avoids the question. He tries again to get information from Parker, who responds that there's no problem with the leader wanting to be alone, especially after hearing the story about his abilities being similar to a dragon's. Mubian asks when Estio disappeared from the camp, and Parker replies that it's been a while. But since Estio is the leader, nothing bad would happen to him. The Duke starts trembling with fear, explaining that the area is still not a safe place, regretting not having warned Estio to be careful. Parker is surprised by this information, while Mubian explains some details about the surroundings of Hygar, containing various types of potential enemies. And because of that, without a guard accompanying the group, only Mubian would be able to ensure everyone's safety. Focusing his vision, he tries to see through the trees of the forest to locate Estio, fortunately spotting him within moments, relieved that nothing bad had happened. Parker suggests that they should go find their leader as soon as possible, but Mubian volunteers to do it, telling them to wait there. He takes a giant leap into the air, surprising the pigeon. He advances carrying his sword in his right hand until he begins to smell blood in the area. He then approaches Estio, asking if the boy is okay. Estio turns to see who had arrived. The Duke finds some cave wolves that were not common in that area and asks why those creatures were with Estio. Not understanding the situation, he imagines that it might be the result of Estio's mental domination and asks simply if Estio was ready to leave. The Duke mentions that they were still having lunch and Estio decides to return to the camp. However, curious about the boy, Mubian questions what he was doing isolated there. Estio shows him an injured wolf in his lap that he had found earlier inside the caves. Its pack lived in the cave, but after they left with the group, they had suffered greatly at the hands of humans. Mubian says that it makes sense because for the Hygar territory, wild animals would be considered a problem, and thus they had to be eliminated. The Renox cave system was the only route linked to the outside world that Hygar territory had, and to ensure the safety of the area, it was necessary to remove the beasts and monsters. After all, if no one did this, defenseless people trying to visit the territory would be devoured by them. Ignoring Estio's situation, Mubian simply advises him to leave them there to live or die, as it wouldn't make any difference in the end. But then, noticing a strange smell, Mubian realizes something different and asks Estio if he'd have fed the injured wolf pup with his blood. Estio responds that he did, saying that in a previous case, his blood had helped another injured animal. Hearing this, the Duke tries to warn him that it wouldn't be a good idea to give his own blood so easily, because if he really was a dragon descendant, his blood would have the power to tame living creatures and turn them into the Black Dragon's personal guardians. Realizing that he was saying too much, Mubian advises him once again to not help the wolves and let the pack fend for themselves from now on. Although he agrees with the Duke's words, Estio seems to find a solution to the problem on both sides, suggesting the possibility that the wolves could promise not to harm the people of Hygar anymore, and then questioning the Duke, asking what the animals would gain in return for respecting this agreement. Mubian recalls that long ago the Black Dragon would intervene in disputes between humans and non-humans, perhaps bringing him closer to his real objective. Mubian explains that merely promising that the wolves wouldn't attack the citizens wouldn't be enough. Instead, he offers them shelter and food in his kingdom in exchange for their strength. After sealing the agreement, everyone returns to the camp at last. Parker is startled by the wolves now following Estio and Mubian as they return together. Estio informs the group that the wolves would be their new companions from now on, along with the Duke. But Parker seems hesitant to trust the pack and is reluctant to share his food with them. While the pigeon complains, Neju approaches the wolves with a cheerful expression. He speaks to Estio, noting that the animal in his arms is just a pup, to which Estio agrees, adding that the poor creature was also injured. With a bad feeling, the boy had taken the pup from its mother to try to save its life. Worried about its condition, he asks Parker if he could help by checking on the wolf. Parker agrees to help as long as no surgery is required, and laying out his materials on a cloth spread on the ground, he begins the treatment. Within moments, Parker notices that the wolf had no visible wounds on its body. If a pup of that size had really been struck by an arrow, it would have pierced right through the animal. But the spot where the wound should have been showed something so minor that it didn't seem serious at all. The wolf's body temperature was also normal, indicating that it was just resting to regain its energy. With this diagnosis, Parker asks Estio if he was really sure that the wolf had been hit by an arrow, and Estio responds that he wasn't certain. As he hides the arrow behind his back, Estio stands up, saying that he might have been mistaken or confused it with another wolf. He tries to conceal what had really happened so that his companions wouldn't know about his abilities, while Mubian silently observes everything. Noticing that Mubian was aware of the arrow he was hiding beneath his cloak, Estio asks the Duke to remain silent. Mubian, not understanding why the boy didn't want his companions to know that he was indeed special, stays quiet. Time passes at the camp, and as the fire dies down, we see Suki sleeping in the trees. Someone then wakes the cat by calling his name, informing him that they would be leaving soon. As he turns to his companions, he now sees a group of wolves staring directly at him. Suki, upon seeing this, asks why those vermin were present as well. Estio explains that they would be their new traveling companions. The cat jumps on Estio's head, not fully understanding the situation, asking him if those wolves were new comrades. Estio replies that the wolves are the new residents of Hygar who could now legally live there. Licking his paws, Suki calms his instincts and asks the boy what their next destination would be. Mubian interrupts the conversation, saying that he had already decided on the next destination, though he hadn't informed the group, feeling a bit awkward about it. Parker asks when he made that decision, and Mubian responds that it was at that very moment. Turning to Estio, Mubian asks a few questions about his homeland, already knowing some details about his life. Estio says that his village is called Selbia, and the Duke, upon hearing this, declares that it would be their next destination. Everyone is shocked by this, and Haru, who already disliked the man, becomes even more displeased, calling the Duke a pervert after trying to figure out his intentions. Estio asks why Mubian would want to visit his homeland, and Mubian begins to explain that at first he only intended to observe the boy, but from what he had noticed, Estio didn't know enough about himself yet. Knowing this, Mubian wanted to meet the people who raised Estio, believing he could discover more about him that way. Estio begins to recall moments from his childhood, remembering that, in fact, the people who raised him weren't his real parents. But that wasn't the real issue. The real reason was that he didn't want to meet those people again, closing his eyes with a fearful expression. Showing no empathy, the Duke approaches the boy, who seemed more emotional, and tells him that he should follow the client's request without complaining. Estio regains control of his mind and agrees that the man was right, setting off towards their next objective. Time passes, and they arrive at a branch of the Ignis Guild called Galasia. Upon entering an establishment, they are greeted by the guild manager named Hawk, who asks his leader if he had been eating well recently. Seeing all the formality in Hawk's tone when addressing him, Estio asks his old acquaintance to speak to him as he used to before. Hawk tries to explain that since Estio had become his new leader, he was now his subordinate. But Estio interrupts, asking him kindly to drop the formalities. With that, Hawk feels more at ease and asks the boy how he's been doing, apparently happy to be visited by him unexpectedly. They begin to chat as they walk, and Hawk mentions that he always knew Estio would become a star because he had a good eye for such things. Now, treating his friend normally, the guild manager starts jokingly asking Estio for a raise or some rewards for his high-quality service. A girl suddenly appears, covering Hawk's mouth to stop him from saying those things in front of the guild leader, and introduces herself to Estio. The girl asks Estio if he is indeed planning to go to Selbia in the river region. She reminds him that the mountain is quite far from their current location, and the group actually has a challenging journey ahead. If they were to walk, it would take a long time to get there, so she and Hawk offer him a carriage. The boy thanks them for the help, and they decide to spend the rest of the day resting there. As night approaches, Estio is seen sitting on his bed, thinking about how everything there is exactly the same as it was the day he left. Suddenly, there's a knock at the door. The boy asks who it is but receives no answer. Estio wasn't expecting any visitors, so he approaches the door cautiously, wondering who it could be. But the person opens the door suddenly, revealing it to be the girl from earlier named Rosalind. She asks Estio if she interrupted his rest, and he responds that she didn't. Rosalind then asks if Estio knows how to ride a horse. He admits that he has never learned, which is unfortunate since the guild doesn't have any carriages available, having already rented out all they had. With only horses left, she could provide some for the group, but since he doesn't know how to ride, they would need to consider another option. Estio informs her that it wouldn't be a problem since the duration of the request is a month, giving them time to travel on foot. Rosalind, still wanting to help, offers to gather some guards to accompany him, but Estio declines. The girl doesn't quite understand his refusal, so Estio explains that even though